Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, December 12th, 2022. And you may have heard a little bit about what we could call a killer robot proposal that came from San Francisco PD and the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. It was initially approved to authorize the city to use robots with lethal force last month. But I've got the inside scoop on this episode, the fact that there was absolutely massive backlash about this. It got international attention even, and there was a quick about face. Once there was public opposition to it and they knew about it, then all of a sudden they wanted to switch sides, and they ended up voting to ban the use of lethal force on robots, at least temporarily. But the only reason that this actually happened, it came to light, was because of a 10th Amendment law that we worked to support and pass last year in 2021, opposing federal militarization of local police. I hope this will all make sense when I go through the episode, but first of all, a quick hello and a huge thank you. Thank you so much for being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. And while we allow people another minute or so, sometimes it takes a little while for these mainstream platforms to get notifications to join us on the live stream. I want to say hi to everyone out in the live chat. There's Kirk Morrison, Liberty Revolutionary, Dixie Strong, Alt Reality, Brian in Georgia, Cheriton Farmer, Clay Davis, Murray Ray, Jonathan Shellman, Cowboy, there's Bonehead, and everyone else. I appreciate you guys being here. Poet Fisherman, I'm not sure if I mentioned you, but hi in Iowa as well. Thank you so much for being here. And you should also follow us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out. That's where you're going to find all the archives of the show. We're also on a bunch of different platforms. You may notice that at some point we happen to be missing from one platform or another. And if that's the case, whether it was by choice or put upon us, we'll say, you'll also be able to find all the other platforms on. We do live streaming on mainstream video platforms. We archive video all over the place, like at BitChute and Gab TV and Minds and Brighteon, but we also have the audio-only podcast edition on all your favorite podcast players. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And I publish a blog post for each episode about 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done, and there you're going to find all the stuff that I'm mentioning in this show, because I'm going to cite a bunch of articles and documents and stuff that you definitely want to check out so you can read in context and learn more on your own time. Anyways, let's get right to this. Again, as I mentioned at the outset here, there was an approval of a San Francisco Police Department proposal by the Board of Supervisors right at the end of November. They gave initial approval to this police policy authorizing remote-controlled robots to use lethal force. I mean, it sounds pretty much like a bunch of movies that we've seen over the years, right? And that can't be a real positive thing, especially when you're talking about people with power having this type of, power. It passed by in a vote of 8-3. Supposedly, the defund the police people in San Francisco were suddenly in favor of giving them remote robot deadly force power. It was reported, it got national attention, even international, was all over the place. BBC News, TechCrunch, New York Post, Fox News, all over the place. I've got the initial San Francisco Police Department, SFPD, proposal up here on the screen. I don't have anything highlighted that I want to specifically read, but it's pretty long and it covers more than just the killer robots, the lethal robots section. But I will link to it in the show notes so you can read it in full on your own time. It is a PDF. You can also download it if you want to save it just for posterity's sake. But anyways, it was covered all over the place. There was a really huge backlash. There was a lot of interest in it. You can see here, BBC News, San Francisco to allow police killer robots. It went all around the world. Here, this one I thought was the most interesting over at National Review, which is not a place I'll read too often. But here from Jim Garrity, I believe, it says something about the political culture and governance of San Francisco that in the span of just a few years, The city can go from an enthusiastic embrace of dramatic cuts to the police budget, which I think that is propaganda. I'm assuming just like here in Southern California and places like Los Angeles, when they talk about cuts to police budget, they really mean a cut to the increase. So the people who love government, whether it's for the military budget or the police budget or the EPA budget, if you even hint at removing or reducing the amount that they increase it, they call it a cut. And I'm assuming that's what was happening in San Francisco, but there was an enthusiastic embrace of that type of thing in San Francisco. So they can go from an enthusiastic embrace of dramatic cuts to the police budget to embracing refunding the police to now an embrace of police robots equipped and enabled to use lethal force. I mean, that is a pretty powerful statement there. And of course, the police always wanted us to think that this would only be used ever in extreme emergency situations, and they'll never go beyond that. Here from the Associated Press, they said the San Francisco Police Department says it does not have pre-armed robots and has no plans to arm robots with guns. Remember that. When they have no plans to do something beyond what they're telling you is an emergency thing, then you should really assume that that's what's going to happen in the future. So they said they currently don't have any pre-armed robots. They do have a bunch of them. A number of them were funded by federal cash. And really, even the ones that aren't directly funded by federal loot or federal grant programs, the federal grant programs to other stuff enables them to have the extra money to buy them out of their own budget. Anyway, so the SFPD just says it doesn't have any currently pre-armed and has no plans in the future to arm them with firearms. But the department could deploy robots equipped with explosive charges to contact, incapacitate, or disorient violent, armed, or dangerous suspects when lives are at stake, SFPD spokesperson Allison Maxey said in a statement. She said, robots equipped in this manner would only be used in extreme circumstances to save or prevent further loss of innocent lives. Now, if you trust people in power, which every one of the founding generation told us you really shouldn't be doing, and more so on the anti-federalist side, people like Patrick Henry said, trusting people, rulers, with the fate of our liberty is a mad attempt. And every time you do that, you will lose your liberty in the long run, or in sometimes the short run. So here, the spokesman for the government is telling us that they're only going to be using this in a very dangerous situation. And I think most people, if you're not thinking about the fact that this comes from government, well, that sounds reasonable. Of course, you want people, if someone is going to be extremely violent, and the only way you can protect the people who are supposed to be doing the good guy stuff is by doing this, well, that sounds reasonable. But one of the most important principles of the American Revolution included a warning against giving government extra power for emergency situations and trusting them to never expand it beyond that. And that brings me to something I've cited many times. This is John Dickinson. He was known as the penman of the Revolution because he gained fame in his publication of Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. It was a series of 12 essays in response to the hated Townshend Acts of 1767. And here in his 9th letter, so these were the most widely read documents on American liberty up until publication of Common Sense in 1776 by Thomas Paine. So people understood the warnings of John Dickinson. And here in his 9th letter, he gave an example of trusting government with emergency power and how soon as you do that, you lose your liberty the moment you trust them, not when they violate the lines that they said they weren't going to go beyond somewhere down the line. And here's how Dickinson put it. It's kind of a long passage, but I think it's important to cover. And I know those of you who've regularly listened to or watched this show, you've heard this many times. Anyways, Dickinson says, Spain was once free. Their Cortes resembled our parliaments. No money could be raised on the subject without their consent. So the representatives of the people were the ones who held the purse strings, right? One of their kings, having received a grant from them to maintain a war against the Moors, desired that if the sum which they had been given should not be sufficient, he might be allowed for that emergency only, and Dickinson put that in italics, he's highlighting this, for that emergency only, to raise more money without assembling the Cortes. So the situation was you couldn't raise a dime in their parliament without the representatives of the people approving it. They weren't in session year-round, so Sometimes they wouldn't get the money that they wanted, but there was a war. And this always happens when it comes to security. When government tells you that they're doing something for your protection, they're almost always, whether in the immediate or short term or the long term, they're really telling you it's so we can control you. And that is how it always ends up playing out. And here Dickinson is noting that in a war situation, a person with power, an individual, wants to be able to raise money without following the rules, without getting the consent of the representatives of the people for just one emergency. And what happened? He said the request was violently opposed by the best and wisest men in the assembly. It was, however, complied with by the votes of a majority. And this single concession, one single step, Thomas Jefferson in 1791, he wrote in his opinion against the constitutionality of a national bank, he said to take a single step beyond the limits of the Constitution is to take a boundless field of power. So he was putting together the same principle that Dickinson was coming up with in 1767. Soon as you establish a precedent to do one thing, you are giving them unlimited power. So he said this single concession was a precedent for other concessions of the like kind, until at last the crown obtained a general power of raising money in cases of necessity. From that period, the Cortes ceased to be useful, and the people ceased to be free. The people lost their freedom as soon as they set the precedent to have unilateral executive power. And this type of thought process can be applied to really anything. Oh, okay. Well, they're just going to have this power to have lethal robots just in extreme emergency situations to save lives of innocent people. And they'll never, ever, they have no plan. Well, they didn't say they'll never, ever. They have no plans of just arming them with sidearms or rifles and things like that. And they won't ever use it for anything else beyond that. But as soon as you give them the tools to do it, you shouldn't be surprised that people in power, even if you, let's say you love the cops in San Francisco, which you shouldn't, you love the government agents in San Francisco, you shouldn't, or in any city, really, you shouldn't. Even if they're doing the things the way you like them today, sooner or later someone else is going to have the power to use that apparatus in ways you don't like in the future. So Dickinson warned us about giving this type of precedent. Back to San Francisco, the backlash against this, it's very similar. The opposition was swift. The backlash was fast and it was intense. But will they end up caving one way or the other? I'm not really sure. We don't know how this plays out in the end. But here from the Marshall Project, this is interesting. We all saw that movie, No Killer Robots. San Francisco protesters wrote on a picket sign last week as they opposed a move by city leaders to authorize police use of lethal force with department-issued robots. Now, it makes it sound like it just came from the department, but it really came from the feds, but we'll get to that in a minute. Here from Common Dreams, in 1 week, San Francisco and the greater Bay Area rallied to tell the board that this policy was unacceptable. That rallying cry was so loud and undeniable that it was impossible for the board and the world to ignore. The campaign to stop killer robots was covered by news outlets all over the world as people waited to see what kind of precedent would be set for law enforcement. So even these people, Common Dreams is hard left, socialist, but on this they really have some good reporting and they're recognizing the precedent. I wish they would recognize the precedent that's set when they give the power to government to do things like protect the environment or provide for health care or all this other stuff, because it is also a precedent and you can't trust these people with power, but that's maybe a different episode. Anyways, they go on with this report, and this is by Matthew Guariglia. I apologize to Matthew if I get your last name wrong. Great report here. Opponents staged a rally against the policy, and over 50 local organizations, including one far off, 10th Amendment Center, signed a coalition letter, which is over at EFF, that I'll get to in a moment, demanding that the board reverse course on killer robots. And they did. And to be honest with you, I'm kind of surprised. Usually, it doesn't matter how much opposition you get on something. If they're really set on doing something for government, they go forward with it. Anyways. But what I've pointed out many times, and maybe I was ignoring my own advice, is that when you focus your efforts on a state or even more so on a local level, it doesn't take nearly as much opposition to actually get things moving in the right direction. And the fact that politicians sometimes are absolutely spineless is really a good thing. If they don't really have any principles and they just flow with the wind, then in a weird way you can leverage that to your favor. Because clearly they wanted to actually support this policy. They knew what they were doing. They were approving it. And I think they thought that they could just get away with passing it. They have to. It's a two-stage process in San Francisco. They give it an initial approval, and then the public hears about it supposedly, or maybe they just ignore it, and then they give it another vote again. And that happens in Los Angeles and many other places. Maybe it happens all over the country. But this one, after the initial passage, word got out, and it got out quickly. And there were rallies and reports, and whether it was Fox News or Common Dreams, everybody left, right, and center was like, this is a little nuts. Let's not go to this. Anyways, here's the coalition letter that was sent to the San Francisco board. I've got a link to it that I will include in the show notes from Electronic Frontier Foundation, which, of course, does amazing work on surveillance and the police state. Here from page 2 of the proposal, it says, San Francisco's proposal would allow officers to send these robots to all arrests and all searches with warrants. So it isn't really an extremely limited scenario where they just try everything else and they're like, okay, we're just going to send in a robot. But even that, I think, also sets a precedent. And to protest even, if police decide that, quote, exigent circumstances or other flexible justification in the policy apply. So basically, it's written so broadly, and this is what happens so often when police get their hands on any restrictions on police. We saw this happen in many states, like in Wyoming, for example, on a so-called Second Amendment Protection Act that was actually the final language that they passed because the police got involved, the police lobby groups got involved in the legislative drafting of it. It ends up protecting absolutely nothing. And here they wrote it so broadly that basically they can send these robots potentially armed with lethal weaponry to all searches with warrants, to all arrests, and to even protest, as long as the police make a determination that, quote, exigent circumstances exist. Now, TAC signed on with this. It's unfortunate you don't find really any other constitutional organizations, but there's not too many here in California anyways. So we signed on with a bunch of groups that probably hate us on a lot of our other policies, but that's how you get things done. You can set aside differences on everything else, but focus on where you have common ground. And that's what we did here in supporting this opposition, I guess, supporting this opposition to the killer robot. Here from Mike Meharry, an article that we published last week about this. He said the backlash was so strong that the board quickly reversed decision Tuesday, which almost never happens, sending some of the proposed policy back to another committee for further review. The 8-3 vote in support of the killer robots, Mike points out, was quickly flipped when the board voted unanimously to explicitly ban the use of robots in such a fashion for now. So it was 8-3 in favor. It was all quiet, hush, hush. Well, not super quiet, but it was happening. No one was making a big deal. But word got out to a very strong local activist coalition in the Bay Area. They do some of the best. If you want to learn how to do activism, even if you don't like the stuff that they do, there is no one in the country better on a local level than the Oakland and San Francisco Bay Area privacy coalitions. They know how to get things done. They get the word out. They work with people. They set aside differences to focus on single issues. They've already had facial recognition surveillance banned in a lot of places in the Bay Area as well because of this. So an 8-3 vote in support suddenly gets flipped around. They unanimously, temporarily at least, ban the policy. They send it back to a committee, and we know they're going to bring this back again. So as John Dickinson talked about in the Letters from a Farmer of Pennsylvania, it was violently opposed. This idea of giving the king additional emergency power to raise funds without the consent of the parliament, the Cortes. It was violently opposed, but eventually they gave way and they gave him that power. So that could still play out exactly like that up in San Francisco. I'm kind of a cynic, so I often think these things are going to happen that way, but it's temporarily totally banned. And I think what they're hoping for is that most people aren't aware that it's going to come back again, that it actually didn't just get totally killed. It was voted and sent back to a committee, put on pause, and then they're going to bring it up again at a later date. That means they're going to work with SFPD to maybe kind of craft a different version of it. Maybe they'll make it environmentally friendly or deal with some other woke issue to basically please the locals. But as long as people stay asleep, or if people go back to sleep, they're definitely going to set a precedent for this and much more. But for the time being, it stopped. And as I mentioned right in the introduction here, it's important to point out that this process is actually very unusual. What's going on in California, this kind of notice and approval approach maybe is the only one of its kind in the country. I'm not 100% sure, but it's a state law that we work to get passed, where anytime local police wants to get military equipment from the feds, or they want to start using it in new ways, or if they want to replace large amounts of it, instead of just doing it, which is what happens everywhere, they actually have to go through this public notice proposal. They have to put out a public notice of what they're doing. Then it has to go through a vote and a recommendation or approval process in the local governing process. Now, usually police get new military-grade equipment, or sometimes like MRAPs, Bearcats, surveillance equipment, drones, helicopters, high-powered weaponry, etc. It's usually funded or gifted by the feds, and they start implementing and using it, and they use new policies with no notice, no public knowledge, no oversight in the process. Here, for example, Honolulu, the police in Honolulu last year used Spot, a $150,000 robo-dog purchased with federal relief fund money through the last 2 years of shutdowns. They start sending out cash to supposedly deal with that. And instead, what do they do in the police in Honolulu? They buy a robot dog to take temperatures of people at a homeless camp. So they're using the people in that situation as a test run to improve algorithms. That's really what we want, is a robot checking temperatures of people. What else is it learning at that point? The New York Police Marshall Project points out, similarly, leased a futuristic-looking robot dog from Boston Dynamics as part of a test program in December 2020. The department used it in several instances, including a hostage situation in the Bronx, but there was opposition to it afterwards. So in general, what's happening, even though this is just barely scratching the surface, we have to understand that the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, and that journey of 1,000 miles is either the journey towards liberty or towards total tyranny. Now, we're not at the first step towards total tyranny today. We're very much down the line, and they want to keep advancing it further and further and further. So the more that they test out these things, even in dangerous situations, emergency situations, or what might be situations that don't impact you or I personally, we have to think about what John Dickinson warned. What's the precedent? If we allow them to use federal relief funds for pandemic for, I don't know, testing people's temperatures, maybe keeping people within the bounds of the homeless camp, and then you let the New York police start using it in hostage situations, where else are they going to use it in the future? And they also point out at Marshall Project that in spite of the failed attempts to introduce police robots at some departments, other cities like St. Petersburg, Florida, seem determined to keep their police robot dogs. I mean, it's wild that we're having this conversation. So most of the time, this stuff, the way the process works is there's federal grant money goes to local police. They just sign off on it on their own. They'd start buying and using stuff on their own with no oversight. So in California, we work to get this legislation passed, AB 481, that says anytime this type of thing happens, first the police have to submit their proposal of what they want to purchase, what they want to receive, what they want to use, and then the local governing body has to actually get involved. Anyways, I cover all or the majority of the main ways that the federal government is unconstitutionally militarizing and nationalizing local police in an episode a couple of years ago that I will link to in the show notes. It's titled War on Liberty, an overview of federal programs that militarize and nationalize local police. We're not supposed to have a national police force, and we certainly do on the federal level, but the feds certainly are turning local police into surveillance and drug and gun control basically agents of the federal state. Anyway, so Mike Meharry, back to his report, he says, until last year, such policy changes, basically deciding we're going to take the robots that we've gotten through federal grant funding in the past, or at least some of them. They didn't say exactly how many in that report, the San Francisco Police Department policy report of what they wanted to do, but they said some of them came through federal grant programs, whether it's the cash and they bought it or they were gifted them from the Pentagon, we don't actually know. But until 2021, they could have just done this on their own. But because of a law passed by the California legislature in late 2021, SFPD was required to not only give public notice, but get approval first. And this is a really good report by Will Jarrett over at Mission Local, maybe the best one I've seen on this. He writes that cities across California are currently drafting new policies on the use of military weapons by local police forces, thanks to a state law called AB 481, which passed last year. Figuring out the force options of robots is one small part of the law's remit. And mind you, again, most of the local governments that get this type of equipment, if you got a Bearcat in Keene, New Hampshire, for example, almost certainly it's directly or secondarily funded by federal grant programs. And without those federal grant programs, police would be far, far different. They'd probably act more like peace officers, maybe, but not nearly as much of a militarized state as we have today. So Will goes on. He says, the law mandates that every police force in California must annually report its stock of all military-style weapons, their cost, how they can be used, and how they were deployed in the prior year. The law gives local authorities, in San Francisco's case, the Board of Supervisors, the ability to annually reject or accept the rules governing how the weapons are used. Interesting. The board will also be required to sign off on any new military-style equipment before purchase or receipt. They don't always just purchase them. Sometimes they're gifted by the 1033 program through the Pentagon, although the police will still be able to replace any existing equipment up to a value of $10 million without approval. So that's a pretty big open there. But anyways, when it first passed, we actually thought it had pretty good potential. I thought, okay, this can create a scenario where you can actually interpose the local community in the process that has up until now been feds to local government directly, with no involvement of the local people, not even the local legislative authorities, none of this. And so this is basically nationalizing, helping nationalize local police, because the feds throw out a bunch of cash. They're like, okay, yeah, we'll help you on your joint drug task force. We'll help you on your ATF task force. No problem. Just keep giving us the millions and millions of dollars. We'll take whatever equipment you need. We'll use cell site simulators. We'll even sign this thing through the FBI that says it's a non-disclosure agreement. And if anyone figures out we're doing warrantless surveillance, we'll just kick it over to the FBI and say this is a federal issue and we're not involved. So they're basically, this is really, really bad stuff. So basically every locality has had to go through this process. Anyways, here from Mike Meharry's report from 2021, he says, while the passage of AB 481 won't end police militarization or stop government surveillance, it will take the first step by creating a framework for accountability and transparency for programs in California. It will also create a foundation for the public to stop their local police from obtaining this type of gear in the first place. And so then this year, once it went into effect, every locality around the state has had to go through the process. And in the first half of the year, I was watching this very closely. I had some alert notifications. I was getting emails every time there was a board meeting or a city council meeting on a local acquisition and use policy by police. And pretty much every local legislative body was acting like a rubber stamp. So the cops would say, here's what we've got, here's what we want to get, here's how we want to use it, and would just automatically get approved, and there's almost no opposition. There were some areas where there was some opposition, and you'd get a first vote, and then you'd get a little bit of opposition, not huge, and then it would be over. They would approve it. So I kind of started putting it out of my mind. But then I think it's because everyone's distracted by national political soap operas, whatever they are. They change from week to week to day, and they never pay attention to what's going on locally. Maybe they don't care. And then this whole thing happened. And Mike writes, because of this law, AB 481, the San Francisco Police Department was forced to reveal its plans to arm robots and get approval for the policy change from the Board of Supervisors. And we know the board was on board with this. They were okay. But because of the public notice, it actually gave the local people a chance to do something about it. Mike says this brought a lot of attention, both locally and nationally. He said, the board's surprising U-turn underscores the power of sunlight coupled with dedicated grassroots activism. But he says, of course, transparency alone doesn't stop government actions. And this is where I was kind of getting like, okay, maybe this isn't a good strategy. You can put all the transparency you want out there, but if the people just suck when it comes to liberty and the power of government, it doesn't change anything. But then again, ultimately, if we're talking about we have to deal with the ultimate sovereignty of the people, it's up to the people. If the people are bad and the people hate liberty, the people love government, then that's really what we have to focus on is the education of the general public. So anyways, transparency alone, Mike writes, doesn't stop the government. Oftentimes, government bodies simply rubber stamp police requests, and in fact, most of the time. But when grassroots activists get involved, they can drive change, as we just saw with the killer robot policy. Transparency sets the stage. It provides a means for the community to know exactly what the government is doing. As the old saying goes, sunlight is the best antiseptic. But ultimately, substantive changes in policy require human action. And that's how Charles Carroll of Carrollton put it some years ago. He said, not a single instance. This is one of these forgotten founders from Maryland that most people have never heard of, but this is some great wisdom here. Brad Bersner has a book on Charles Carroll that you should check out. Not a single instance can be selected from our history of a law favorable to liberty obtained from government, but by the unanimous, steady, and spirited conduct of the people. So it ultimately gets down to the people, whether they have to pressure their people locally in government or the people learn how to exercise their rights, whether government wants them to or not. On this situation, I'm not sure how the latter would have played out, but the process played out the way that we wanted to, at least on this one. In almost every other local community, it has not. In Oakland, they were able to stop a few things as well. It's the same coalition. I doubt it's going to happen down in Los Angeles or, well, who knows. Anyways, Mike says without AB 481, without passage of that law that we saw as a tiny step that we didn't get a lot of community support on, but we worked in favor of, well, without that, no one would have known about the killer robots until they would have been armed and used. No one would have known. But without the concerted effort, Mike says, so we have the sunlight, but on top of that, without the concerted effort of concerned individuals pressuring the government, they would have gotten those killer robots anyway. So I think it's a very important lesson about the combination of sunlight and relentless, massive grassroots activism. I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. If you support the work we're doing and you want to help us get this info out to more people, nothing helps us get that job done more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Don't feel any obligation to join us, but if you do have a little bit of extra of that nasty government fiat, throw it our way. No one takes a stand for the Constitution and liberty more than here at the TAC, and nothing helps us get that done more than your financial support. So thank you so much for any consideration you can give to join us. Let me take a look over in the chat and see if there's any comments I can get back to. Man, there's a lot. I'll probably have to read through these a little bit later. You can also email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com, if you've got some questions or suggestions. I get a lot of great ideas for future episodes. I will read through ahead of Bladesmith, make them. Kirk Morrison says, obtain what you want and tell no one, said Liberty Revolutionary. And I think that's the approach that I was talking about. It's the Jeffersonian view that a free people claim their rights is derived from the laws of nature and not as the gift of their chief magistrate. If you have to get a permission slip from government, this is, I know, a side note from this episode, but I think it all really ties in together. Ultimately, it gets down to the people taking action. Sometimes they have to pressure a local governing body, but really they have to learn how to be free, whether the government wants them to or not. Alt Reality says, keep up the good fight, MB, Poet Fisherman. Thanks, MB and TAC crew. Honestly, I could only cover this stuff. There's no way I could even do this show if it wasn't for the great reporting and blogging from people like Mike Meharry, TJ Martinell, and so many others that we report on, and people doing work over at the TAC blog. We have over 10,000 articles, probably close to 12,000 articles, blogs, stuff published on our website over the years. There's so much information. Again, I appreciate you being here. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you had an awesome weekend. I hope your week is off to a good start, and I hope to see you next time here on the path to liberty. Hope you have a great day.